Welcome to this webinar on Normal People, A View from the West. Sally Rooney's novel and its 12-part TV adaptation have certainly generated a remarkable response in Ireland, the UK, the US, and no doubt beyond. So I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to bring together colleagues and friends to discuss this phenomenon from various different perspectives. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. We have a great group of participants today, and I will introduce them now in brief, alphabetically. Keith Duggan is a journalist and sports writer with the Irish Times, and also an adjunct lecturer in journalism at NUI Galway. Patrick Lonergan is professor of drama at NUI Galway in the O'Donoghue Centre for Drama, Theatre and Performance, and he's co-head of discipline, and he's also a member of the School of English and Creative Arts. Mehar Luthra is originally from New Delhi, India, and has published a book of short stories called And Then the Light Turned Green, available on Amazon India. She is a student on NUI Galway's MA in Writing. Charlotte McIvor is lecturer in drama at NUI Galway in the O'Donoghue Centre. She's co-head of discipline and is also a member of the School of English and Creative Arts and deputy head of school. Diane Negra is professor of film studies and screen culture at University College Dublin. She joins us from Long Island, so she qualifies as a voice from the West. Adrian Paterson is a lecturer in English at NUI Galway and a member of the School of English and Creative Arts. Maria Tivnan is an IRC-funded PhD candidate, researching how theater creates the meaning of home in Galway, Gaza, and Mexico. And she's also the artistic director of Fragoli Theatre Company since its establishment in 2007. Justin Tonra is lecturer in English and member of the School of English and Creative Arts at NUI Galway. And Tony Tracy is lecturer in the Houston Film School and Digital Media at NUI Galway, and likewise a member of the School of English and Creative Arts. Our session today is being recorded. It's going out to an even wider audience via Facebook. And David Kelly, the Digital Humanities Manager in the Moore Institute, is handling the technical side of the event behind the scenes. I'm grateful to him as ever. In participating, 111 people had signed up at last look. In terms of participating, there's a chat function, which is probably the main one to use. There's also Q&A, but we'll try to keep an eye on that and keep abreast of your comments and thoughts. Maria, I wanted to kick things off with you. You wrote an RTE brainstorm piece on normal people. And I just wondered if you could say a little something about the kind of audience that Sally Rooney has been capturing and the audience following the series itself.
Okay, so I'll start with something I don't normally start with, which is a few figures, if that's all right, it kind of gives a really good picture of how big this actually is. So as regards the book, so it would have sold to the worth of over 4 million in the UK and 1 in Ireland. And just to put that in perspective, Ireland's biggest selling author would be Marion Keyes, who in her lifetime would have sold 49.4 million in the UK and 6.7 in Ireland. But when you put that with Sally Rooney, who's only 29, and this is one book, like it's not, it's quite a big thing. And just after and during the series, the book was reselling again, so it went to the #1 bestseller in Ireland, the UK. It's at #2 at the moment. And in the US, she would have sold 184,000 copies as of May, and it's been endorsed by the likes of Sarah Jessica Parker and stuff like that. So that tends to have lots of legs. The TV series figures, though, are just much more staggering, and all that came out of that. So it broke the record for RTE Player. I'd say it nearly broke RTE Player in general. But there was 3.3 million streams in RTE Player and an average of 319,000 people watching it live per episode, and 38 million streams on the BBC iPlayer. And then just things like out of that, like so Connell, one of the characters, has his chain has an Instagram page that has 183,000 followers. And Paul Mescal, who people think is actually Connell, not Paul Mescal, has 860,000 followers on Instagram. And just stuff like his GA shorts are now being made by Gucci and selling for $550 a pop. So that's kind of the phenomenon that is normal people.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. I did see the story about Gucci, and I've never thought of GAA shorts as being very fashionable, but there you go. I'm clearly behind the trend. I do think the series has probably, at least in Ireland, shifted a lot of Casiera del Diablo, which was the wine sponsor of the event. Diane, I was going to ask you for your thoughts. I thought we'd make a little bit about the series first, because that has just had such an extraordinary following. And I wonder, I know your specialism is in film and television, and your thoughts on this phenomenon and the series.
Well, I guess there are two things that I would single out, and both of them are more on the international side, although I think the story of the series' success in Ireland is extremely interesting in its own right. But I guess I would see Normal People as part of a somewhat accelerating pattern of Irish-made and Irish-themed television that sits within the canon of global quality TV. And so I would want to position it in relation to things like The Fall, Derry Girls, Dublin Murders, maybe even at a stretch Run with Donald Gleeson, which is over here now in the States. Normal People has gotten a lot of attention from the New York Times. So it's being recognized as a particular kind of Irish export. And I think that's an interesting feature of its success. The other thing that I would single out initially about it is that Normal People, and this maybe makes it a little different to some of the other series I just mentioned, it offers itself into the market as what television studies people would call an auteur series. In other words, it comes with some authorial branding that's seen to heighten its pre-sold interest. And in the case of this particular series, that comes in the form of two different people, Lenny Abrahamson on the one hand, who's making what's now a common transition from independent film to television. And also in the case of Sally Rooney, who of course links to a cluster of Irish female literary figures who are associated with, on the one hand, radical stylistic experimentation, but also candor about female life experiences. And I think that cluster of books has helped to move the needle of national literary culture. So I would single out those two things, that the new status that Normal People has in global TV, and also the way in which it operates as a kind of a branded auteur-based TV.
And you were mentioning, the coverage in the New York Times, which I was looking at. It certainly has had a lot of attention there. I mean, have you been very aware of it while you've been in the U.S. during the pandemic? Have you had a sense, oh, this is happening here, or does it get absorbed into the mass of television production there?
Well, to be honest, I think it's become one of these positive pandemic stories in a funny way. And what I mean by that is that Ireland has come out of and I'm hoping I can use terminology like come out of the pandemic experience, or at least its most severe weeks this spring, as having a positive national reputation, and that links to some slightly oddball lifestyle journalism. I'm thinking about Matt Damon in Ireland. I'm thinking about reporting on the generosity of Irish people to the Choctaw Nation and things like this. But another lens that you could apply to Normal People, the TV series, not necessarily the book, is as a form of pandemic television. In other words, it had the good fortune to be released in a moment when I think the question of intimacy, sexuality, and romantic connection had an extraordinary resonance, because people were living through a period of sterility and social deprivation and exhaustion underlying. So I think that might also explain its success.
Yeah, interesting. We might come back to that. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in your linking it with those other things. I mean, Matt Damon and his famous shopping bag.
Yeah.
Extraordinarily widely circulated image.
Yeah.
During the crisis. Yeah, Tony, I was going to come to you next, and to get your sort of take on it as a series. Diane has already given some thoughts about that, but what is your view as a kind of film scholar and somebody who's looking at it as a kind of production, I guess, in that sense?
Yeah, well, I think it sort of presents, well, the attitude that we sort of have here isn't this incredible. It's this sort of attitude like, wow, people are interested in Irish stories, and it's very local and very specific. And I think the other people who've spoken so far have begun to articulate that it is not that there is a pre-brand, a very significant pre-brand in the series, which of course is the success of Sally Rooney and the success of Sally Rooney in certain metropolitan centres of publishing in the English-speaking world, London and New York in particular, which may distort our kind of sense of the global, impact or our knowledge of the pre-existing property. The series is so interesting because it seems to me to represent a kind of an apogee of several tendencies and a kind of a local global product, a simultaneously local and global product. In many ways, the series is a testimony to the failure of RTE to cultivate national drama. And it's also a happy failure in a sense, because the producers have to go abroad for funding. And that search abroad for funding when they bought the rights of the book before it was published coincides happily with a completely and radically shifting global screen culture, principally the notion of OTT services, of over-the-top streaming services. And in this case, those two services are BBC Three and Hulu, both of which are searching for a demographic which has kind of gone a little bit missing in screen culture, which is the 18 to, well, it depends, you know, I mean, normal people were supposed to be maybe 39, but it's been watched by a huge demographic. So it's an interesting kind of failure on one hand of a kind of a national TV broadcaster, but also and that coinciding with a radically shifting global screen culture. Also, as Diane sort of suggests, intersecting then with a kind of a globalized publishing industry and a kind of also rapidly shifting auteur art house cinema market. So all of those things feed into this moment. We don't know the statistics on Hulu. We do know, obviously, on BBC, and we know on RTE, but RTE, as I say, would be the natural home and sponsor for it, but actually really are just a broadcaster who bought it in at the end.
That's interesting, because I suppose, I mean, in my naive perspective, RTE has sort of presented it as its own in a way. It was, I guess, shown a day later. It wasn't a BBC, it was Mondays, and RTE Tuesdays. So that might reflect something about the, you know, who had rights privileges and so on.
Well, I think I just say one thing on that in case it gets lost, in that its transmission and its circulation in Ireland was completely unique, in that it was essentially sold and funded as a niche project to a niche audience, and the kind of splintering of screen audiences is a real dilemma as well as an opportunity. I mean, OTT services have something like $35 billion to spend this year between Netflix and Amazon and so on. So there's a massive proliferation of product. But in Ireland, it played completely differently, in that because it went through RTE, which, as I said, you know, had developed earlier series with Element. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Bachelor's Walk and Pure Mule, which are the natural antecedents to this series in Ireland. It was perceived here as a national TV event, which was intensified by the lockdown. And that intensification, both through where it was screened here primarily, in other words, not through the over-the-top systems in the US and the UK, the intensification of national identity, as Diane has sort of alerted us to, and intimacy, gave normal people a national kind of resonance, which then was played out on the Joe Duffy kind of environment. But that's a happy accident, I think, rather than the way we've perceived it as a kind of national TV event.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, we might come back to some of the questions raised there, partly about what this means for the future of Irish television and other things. Which, Charlotte, I wanted to ask you next. I mean, I've been rereading the novel, and I know you have wide interest, obviously, in drama, but you've also got this important project on sexual consent. And Normal People does look like a rather useful text, if I could put it that way. So I wondered if you, might give us your take on it.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Dan. And indeed today, despite the many titles of mine that you read at the beginning, I'm coming at this largely from within the active consent program, where we work with young people ages 16 to 24 in a sex positive way, doing research and designing interventions in order to give greater skills in what we term consent literacy. So I spend a lot of time, I suppose, thinking about representations of sexuality, and my role within that project is to run our creative arts and communications. As a plug, we're releasing the first national survey on sexual experiences in Ireland in 7 years, focusing on sexual violence and harassment this coming Monday at 11 a.m. And as a spoiler, I'll say that the statistics there are quite damning in terms of the levels of violence and harassment being reported even in the year 2020. And I'm very aware that young people are far more likely to engage with normal people than ever read our report. So I think a really robust conversation around this series is really important, and to keep that conversation going after the phenomenon. I think Normal People has been hugely significant in its depiction of consent in some very key moments, such as the first sexual encounter between Marianne and Connell, such as when he stands up for her in the club when she's groped by one of their friends. You know, we've had the longest sex scene on Irish television, and coming from a sex positive program, I say thumbs up there. It was a historical event. But I do think that there are some real elephants in the room about particularly femininity, consent, and trauma in the show. And in general, you know, having read deeply the novel, watched the series, I don't understand why we're not saying more or reckoning with the fact that Marianne, in general, to me, I will go out on a limb and say feels to me to be quite a thin characterization, and that the novel really, and both double down on the persistent linking of her sexual appetites to unresolved trauma and unresolved violence. And not only that, but the role of Connell within the story from her perspective, and as endorsed by the narrative, is to redeem her, which is a word that is literally used towards the end of the novel, at which point I wanted to throw my Kindle across the room. I mean, I would have thought that 50 Shades of Grey set the bar for problematic depictions of BDSM quite high, but in some ways, I think this novel surpasses it. And that is troubling. I think, you know, we see this play out as well in one of the other parodic moments of consent on the series, quote unquote, when she asks Connell to hit her after they get back together and he says no. And even within our own active consent social media, we pointed to it as, look, a moment when your partner doesn't want to do something you're into, how do you handle that? But in that moment, Marianne finally understands that her desires are wrong, and it's immediately followed by Connell rushing in and saving her from violence at the hands of her brother. So what happens to Marianne's agency? What happens to complexity of desire? What happens to understandings of survivors of violence as other than twisted and just seeking more violence to continue that cycle? And I suppose it wouldn't bother me as much if we hadn't seen this before and over again. And in a lot of actually really successful, in many ways interesting as well, other contemporary literature by women. I'm thinking of Queenie by Candice Carty Jenkins, even though I think it does some more interesting things with the conceit, Jade Sharma's Problems, which is also complicated for other reasons, but I think tellingly in Emer McBride's The Lesser Bohemians as well. And I'm not saying as a woman, as a feminist, that we need to produce unproblematic or uncomplicated and politically correct female heroines. Absolutely not. But I do think that we need to stay with that trouble of why is there this triad of trauma, rough kink, BDSM, misconstrued, and also disordered eating actually across those novels as well. And the fact that people are identifying with it in the numbers that Maria has quoted so brilliantly there, you know, it's troubling me. And I think that we need to be speaking about the complexities more openly.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's also that incident with the teacher, Miss Neary, who is the supporting characters in the novel are not terribly well imagined, I think, in general, with some exceptions. I think, you know, Lorraine, the mother, is kind of interesting. But the teacher who he bizarrely meets up in a nightclub, like she's just hanging out there, you know, checking out the talent, I guess.
Yeah.
So there's a moment there where he's, you know, disturbed and troubled by a non-consensual thing. Now he got a bit of a drink issue, so he's well gone at that stage. I don't know whether you had observations on that particular incident. And
I think what's interesting is the series actually delved into that far less than the novel did. I mean, something that I find a feature, particularly of conversations with friends as well, is, of Normal People, is that interesting things will happen and then completely drop out. And, you know, the character of Lorraine, I want to see a whole series about Lorraine, which probably just shows me for the aging feminist that I am. But, you know, she has a brilliant scene where she calls him to task for shaming behavior, but then she kind of disappears from the novel, right? So I think, you know, as a piece of literary work, there's a lot of loose ends there.
Yeah. Mehar, I wanted to ask you, I think there is probably a transition there because I know you have an interest, well, in Sally Rooney's work as a whole, but you're also interested in the kind of question of mental health and mental illness and how that plays into the structure of the narrative. So I wondered if you might talk a little bit about that.
Sure, thanks, Dan. And Charlotte, I'm in love with you. I could not agree more with anything and everything that you've said. And just to build on that, first off, I'd just like to say that I really like the fact that the makers of the series, they stuck to the essence of the book. Like, now, whether that book is flawed or not is another matter, but they stuck to the text, which I appreciated, because I feel that the characters in the book are so well sketched out, like at least the lead characters are, that it was a treat to sort of see them on screen, and the actors were brilliant in that. Frankly, for me, that they genuinely did become Marianne and Connell. I think they did a brilliant job. Another thing that I loved about both the book and the series is that there are so many of these clear incidents dealing with mental health issues. Like, they're very obviously, they occupy center, pride of place. Like, you know what you're going into when you read them or when you see them on screen. I mean, take Marianne's family background, for instance. I was fascinated by that. Very early on, we're told that Marianne's father used to abuse her mother, that there was domestic violence in that sort of relationship. And then later on, we see that Marianne's mother essentially takes a step back and sort of lets that cycle of violence perpetuate into the next generation. You know, like now with her son abusing her daughter, I felt that that was a really keen appraisal of the fact that abused women sometimes do have a role to play in perpetuating and in widening that circle of violence that's there. Mm-hmm. And I think that Marianne suffered abuse at the hands of both her mother and her brother, with her mother contributing to the notion that such hostile environments or such hostile people in your family who denigrate you and who sort of decimate your self-confidence, that the notion that it's okay, it's acceptable, normal, even when it's really not. And we see later on in the series when Marianne asks her mother, like, why didn't you put a stop to it, or why don't you put a stop to it? And she just simply shrugs and says, well, what do you expect me to do about it? And you know, that scene was really pivotal, because finally Marianne got up the courage to actually ask her mother why she just stood by and let all of these happen to her, and all she got was an unsatisfactory shrugging of the shoulders. Like, I think that was a really great scene to talk about as well. Another thing that really spoke to me was the fact that this abuse, it happens incrementally and in stages. So it doesn't happen all in one go or in one episode. Like, we see a gradual build-up of all of this over episodes and over years. And I think that's such a great conversation to have, frankly, because you can't take these incidences in isolation or in a vacuum. Like, if you were to pluck one of these instances out and you regale it, you tell it to a third-party observer who doesn't know the history, the argument could be made that it's not that bad, or it's not all bad, or perhaps that the victims themselves may have overreacted. And I think this sort of analysis can turn around and lead to, like, gaslighting the victims. Like, no, you know, don't take this in isolation. It's not in isolation. It's something that happens day in and day out. If you're living with a family member who chooses to abuse you, and I think just seeing it on screen, for me at least, I think it paves the way for a broader discussion on this topic. We should be talking about it. No, your feelings are valid, even if it may not seem that way to someone outside of your family, but it is valid to you. And that's a conversation we should be having, in my opinion. And I think Marianne's complex family background slides in very neatly in her relationship with Connell as well. Not very well. I agree with Charlotte there, in the sense that not all people who are abused turn to kinky sex or BDSM. They're completely, people who come from very strong family backgrounds might want to do that as well, and that's their choice. And I think it doesn't necessarily stem from one thing. But also, in my opinion, I think the two characters, it's so interesting to see that I think they're both submissive in their own right. Like, Marianne, obviously more so, as we see later on, that she prefers a submissive role in relationships. and prefers a dominant partner in that sense. But I feel that in this tussle between the two submissives, we see really good TV. I remember this one scene where Marianne and Connell, they're still in school and they go to this ghost house, and Marianne tells Connell that, you know, I would lie down on the ground right here and now, and I would do whatever you want me to do. Like, I'm completely in your power. And I think if we watch that scene, it's beautifully captured, and you see Connell being horrified at having that sort of power over another individual, and especially someone who he loves dearly. And you can see the visible hesitation on his face when, like, he wants to take a step back, but he also realizes that what Marianne needs at the time is just comfort and some reassurance, and he gives her that. And I think this tussle goes on again and again. It's repeated again and again in the series. It happens constantly when they date, and then they break up, and then they date again. And, you know, it was incredible to watch these two people who have this emotional baggage, like, find each other and be there for each other. And I think it was well done. At least that bit was delicately handled and in a nuanced way.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's been a lot more public attention to the sexual relationship and so forth, but less to the kind of mental strains in a sense. And the book and the series both do. It's a kind of delayed introduction to that aspect of her life. So it's the meaning significant is worked out later chronologically, which in itself is kind of interesting. I was thinking also of that moment in the series, and I'm not entirely sure about it, but it's when Marion has come back and she's spending Christmas with Connell and Lorraine, and then they see Denise, the mother, on the street, and then they're in the car, and Marianne says, well, what do people think of my mother?
Yeah.
And then it's sort of like, and there's long hesitation, and Lorraine says, she's a bit odd, which is idiomatic. I'm not entirely sure I was satisfied with that. But anyway, that's maybe a digression.
But it also, it speaks to the fact that this is the first time that Marianne has ever wondered about her mother as an objective party. Like, she's actually asking for an objective opinion, because up until now, she was so wrapped up in the family dynamics of it that she never even thought to ask before then. So I think that's, yeah.
Keith, I was going to turn to you. I mean, you wrote an interesting and somewhat mischievous piece focusing on Connell. Now, I know you have a sports writing background, and I was interested in your take in it. And I choose a fancy word. There are aspects of masculinity in the book and the series that are quite interesting. But maybe you could say something more about Connell as a sportsman and what you thought a different narrative arc. Again, to use a somewhat fancy terminology that the book and the series don't pursue.
Yeah, I mean, the book, the passage in the book in which Connell scores the goal in the schools cup final or schools match, it's fairly brief. But I remember at the time thinking it was one of the stronger passages in the entire book, because in his own way, I think he's much like Marianne's character. He's kind of an outsider. He's reluctant in the role that he has in the school. He has kind of this power within the school corridors and class, but he really doesn't want to embrace it, and he's sort of helpless, to do anything about it, really. And I think, obviously, in the TV series, Connell becomes a Gaelic football star, whereas in the book, I think Sally Rooney has him as a soccer player.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that column, I just thought it would be a bit of fun to imagine Connell on top of all his other anxieties and worries, racked with guilt about the fact that he wasn't coming back home to, fictional Carey to train at weekends with his GAA club. So yeah.
You had a nice line in there. You call him a young Werther with a handy left peg. I thought that was very good. Hard to improve on that. But you're right, because I mean, and for me, I mean, I'm American. I wonder if Diane might think this too, with our shared nationality. But there is a little bit of an element of the American high school movie to all of this, or scenario. I don't know how well established that is as a genre in Ireland, but it's certainly pretty well established in America. I don't know if you had a thought on that, Diane, about the American.
It did strike me that Normal People taps into a variant of the cross-class university set romance narrative. And I think the biggest example of that type that we have is Love Story in the 1970s, which was, of course, hit. I mean, there are other lesser examples. I'm thinking about Oxford Blues with Rob Lowe and this guy. But maybe, you know, another pertinent example is also the way in which St. Andrews achieved a certain kind of third level status and branding through the romance of William and Kate, right? So I do think it's not completely incidental to what goes on in this, that the university is the place where you find yourself and you debate the most critical issues of life is, you know, it's a big part, I think, of how this series resonates.
Yeah. That's one of the things I liked about your piece, Keith, was partly that it, in a way, you were drawing attention to a different romance narrative. Yeah, a sporting achievement and a certain kind of social acceptance that comes with it is one payoff. The book is very much taking us towards romance in a somewhat more, you know, familiar narrative kind of structure. Justin, I wanted to turn to you and for your thoughts on the novel. I know you're also interested in Sally Rooney as a kind of figure of celebrity too, but if you had reflections on the book.
Yeah, I've been thinking recently about why it became a bestseller, and more generally about the Rooney phenomenon, I suppose. So I've also enjoyed reading Conversations with Friends as well, which really launched her as a literary celebrity, but certainly not to the same degree that happened after Normal People, which became instant and runaway bestseller. So I've been thinking a little bit about the shape and the structure of those two novels, really to try and figure out, you know, what is it about Normal People that has made it such a literary phenomenon. And so I think there's a couple of elements, and Charlotte alluded to one of those, I think, which is of interest by naming 50 Shades of Grey. Normal People has been referred to as 50 Shades of Sligo. But the focus on the sex in the novel is, I think, useful in terms of comparisons with 50 Shades of Grey. But in broader terms, people who have studied the phenomenon of best-selling literature have tended to say that you know, novels with a lot of sex in them do not tend to be bestsellers. And I've examined 50 Shades of Grey as an outlier in this respect. So I think it's interesting that there is a similar focus on the sex in Normal People in that context. I think the themes in the novel, a lot of them are quite archetypal. So the idea of the country and the city divides, the home and away divides as well. Elements of the campus novel and of class and money are all very conventional archetypal themes for literature. But I think the one that is, I guess, that pervades all of these, and which is a theme very commonly found in bestsellers, is just the theme of human closeness, right? And characters relating to one another emotionally. So the sex in the novel is emphasized, I think, on the TV series in a way that it's perhaps not as prominent in the novel. I haven't seen all of the TV series. It's been a little while since I read the novel, but in watching the first few episodes, I certainly, you know, someone alluded to the longest sex scene in Irish TV. It did strike me that this was an element that was perhaps emphasized to a degree. The previous novel, her Conversations with Friends, I think is more thematically diverse, right? So it doesn't have the kind of narrow focus on these couple of central topics that are there in Normal People. So I do think that is an element that's contributed to its status as a bestseller. The plot as well, I think, has a similar level of tightness compared to Conversations with Friends. It has this quite effective symmetry that you generally see in bestseller plots. So we have this 3-act structure of school and college and then post-college. But throughout, there's this very, very careful design to the emotional modulations between of the relationship between Connell and Marianne. So we have this kind of this tracking up and down of highs and lows of the relationship, and this is again a common feature of best-selling novels. What did strike me as interesting was this repetition of the holiday-based set piece scene that is there in Conversations with Friends as well. And when I saw that, I thought, well, Rooney is repeating herself here. But I've also thought that she, in that context, that she thought very carefully about these kind of structural plot elements. In terms of the language in the novel, she has a good command of dialogue, I think, and there's a lot of engaging kind of everyday conventional language, which you need to have a best-selling novel. I think there's a greater ease and clarity of language in Normal People than there is in Conversations with Friends. I think Rooney kind of wears her obvious intelligence more easily in Normal People, whereas in the previous novel, it's more to the fore, right? So there are these kind of very interesting, I think, dialogues between characters about politics and aesthetics and things like this, but they're worn quite heavily. And just the characters, finally, the dynamics of their relationship really drives all of the successful best-selling features in the novel. Again, it's tighter. It's a relationship between two people, whereas in Conversations with Friends, you have this love triangle, love rectangle, really between four characters. So you have this narrower focus in Normal People, and these essential kind of affinities and sympathies between Connell and Marianne, who are similar characters in some sense. In some senses, you get this impression of them being two sides of the same coin at certain times, and how they're influencing one another. There's this important archetypal conflict, right, between these two characters that's established right there at the beginning. In fact, in the first sentence, if I could do a little close reading for a second, reads, Marianne answers the door when Connell rings the bell. Right, so you have, I guess, after reading the novel, thinking back to that sentence, you have a whole range of topics and themes illustrated really beautifully and neatly in that first sentence. So it's present tense also gives it this wonderful immediacy and I guess illustrates that kind of beck and call element to the relationship throughout the novel. And just finally, the penultimate sentence as well, I think really just sums up and illustrates the dynamics of the relationship. It reads, people can really change one another, right? So I think the dynamics of these characters are just one of a number of elements that has made it, a best-selling phenomenon.
Thanks. I'm going to sort of come to Patrick and Adrian almost at the same time, because you were both teaching the book this semester. So you have an interesting insight, I guess, into how, to a certain extent, closer to the age group of people who are depicted in the book. So I was just kind of interested in whether you might offer some observations on either how you approached it from a teaching point of view, or what you felt the students were particularly responding to or picking up on. I don't know whether Patrick or Adrian, who wants to go first?
Because we both taught the course, but I lectured on it, so maybe I can talk a little bit about some of the student responses, but then talk about how it fit into the course more generally. And I mean, I think one of the reasons to put this novel on the course is because our students are reading it anyway. And, you know, I was very struck by the fact that the issues that Charlotte mentioned earlier in relation to consent that need to be discussed. When you read the book, I also noticed that, you know, my students were already reading the book in order to discuss those issues. As they were also doing with, say, Louise O'Neill's novel, asking for it, and indeed other books as well. And I think, you know, in teaching it, what really struck me is the extent to which students who were of that age, you know, kind of late teens, early 20s, they really got so many of the codes that were in there. Like there's a scene where Connell shows up at a house party in Trinity with Dutch gold and finds that people there are drinking Cointreau. And, you know, that's a very straightforward signifier of how social class works in Ireland, that people just instantly got in ways that were quite interesting. And I think similarly, you know, just small things like the fact that, you know, we find out at one stage Connell is a Liverpool fan. And I mean, I don't know if Keith would agree with this, but like if you're a Liverpool fan in 2012, it means you've got a kind of a thing for lost causes, which I think helps us to understand his later interactions with Marianne a little bit as well. And, you know, I think what's really interesting about the novel, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to teach it as well, I think it's a very, very well written novel. I had found that conversations with friends gave us characters who were very narcissistic. And it was interesting because of that, but I just wanted to get beyond the narcissism. And I think this novel does that because it shows us these characters, both their interiority and how they seem to others. And it's a really nice balance, I think, that works very well. So I think, you know, from that point of view, it's a book that's just technically very well put together. But I think, you know, in addition to that, it gives us a way into thinking about other books. I mean, it's very straightforward to go from Normal People to Edna O'Brien to The Country Girls, which we didn't include, but, you know, did actually come up in conversation with a lot of the students. And it's very easy to go from there to The Last September, which I know Adrian lectured on. And there's a lovely scene in The Last September in which the protagonist, a young woman, overhears people talking about her and has a dilemma where she's trying to work out, well, do I want to hear what they're saying about me or not? And again, it's that thing of the interior and the exterior that really you get in a lot of Irish literature. And so Sally Rooney gives us a way, you know, to draw all of those things together. But it also gives us Ireland in a very broad international context. I mean, these are characters who live in Sligo and in Dublin and never once mention William Butler Yeats or James Joyce. They're people who read James Baldwin, not James Joyce. They listen to Kanye West. They watch Hitchcock. And so on. So I think as a kind of a cultural, as a statement of where our culture is right now, it's fascinating in terms of social class, fascinating that despite being a very obviously definitively Irish novel, there isn't the stuff in there about Catholicism or the land or any of those other kind of Daniel Corkery themes that we thought Irish literature should always explore. So it's doing something new, but it's also very true to the past. And I think that's where it linked up very well with the material that Adrian was teaching.
Yeah. So yeah, Adrian, your thoughts on that? Partly as a Yeatsian, I know you might have thoughts on that side of the equation.
I can mention Yeats. It struck me generally as a lot of people have been talking about the kind of national reputation of Ireland being associated with this novel. It's a kind of global product or even a useful text for us to use, and that struck me as kind of interesting. It's also troubling that a book should have so much invested in it, or a TV series should have so much invested. The burden of representing a nation to the world is quite difficult. But what struck me is that wasn't new entirely. I mean, actually, you know, the idea that a text or a central phenomenon should in some way market Ireland, in some way kind of represent Ireland, is actually does go back to the 19th century in lots of ways, and goes back to figures like Yeats and even earlier to, you know, people like Thomas More, who Justin has worked on. Because, I mean, in very clever ways, I think they were also marketing Ireland, often using the place names of Ireland to cultivate a kind of conscious exoticism of a certain kind. And although Rooney, I think, would disavow a connection with Yeats, there's a great interview in the Irish Independent, which he says something about, I hate Yeats. You know, he's basically, when I was taught, he was a horrible person, and I don't know why he should be the representation of Ireland for everyone. And when at school we just get a hagiography, that really we just get a representation of this person who did these nice poems about nice Irish landscape, and she wanted to do something different. And what the irony is, of course, that she's also in some way now herself, by being such a phenomenon, representing Ireland in that way. I don't think it's entirely unfitting though, because as I say, in some way all the newness of this is really, it does seem to me a kind of 19th century phenomenon. The way people have been talking about the novel is, I think, quite reasonable in terms of the characters being real characters and their interactions mattering to people. I mean, that's the sort of thing that, you know, people interacted with Dickens's characters in that way, right? That they were conscious that they were doing something important to them and were somehow representing themselves and had opinions about what they were wearing and what they were saying, and, you know, the chains around their necks and things like that. For people to be so invested in characters is a kind of 19th century realist phenomenon. And I think Rooney says so herself. She says basically, some critics have noticed that my books are basically 19th century novels in contemporary dress, and I think that's about right. That a lot of what they're doing is a you know, Justin was talking about kind of archetypes, is sort of, you know, reinvesting and reinventing these familiar archetypes of what novels should do in a contemporary setting. But of course, in the 19th century, when they were, although historical novels were quite common, a lot of them were set at the present day. So that's not new in itself. Having said all that, I do think the novel has things of interest in how it says things. Not so much what it says and what happens in the plot and what the characters are like, so much as how things are presented. I think it was Justin mentioned dialogue and the back and forth, but the kind of careful, kind of emotional gradations that are there in the dialogue seem to me kind of interesting. And also the things that are not in dialogue, the things that we learn about conversations with people is, as people have said, really much about the dialogue and the interaction, the kind of dissent and, you know, Bakhtinian kind of dialogue. Everything is dialogue in that novel, which is a kind of classic novelistic thing. But normal people is partly that, but I think also interested in what people are reading and what they're writing. So there are exchanges, of course, in things that are not language, spoken language, I mean, and, you know, and Marianne reads some of Connell's stories, that kind of thing. And there's, you know, the suggestion that we might be interested in kind of an interior world in which people are reading each other's work, or in sense reading themselves, is, I think, quite interesting. I mean, the epigraph finally, I think, is from Daniel Deronda, is that right? So there's some sense in which it's obviously marking itself as being a kind of interested in the 19th century phenomenon. I think in two ways: one in the texture of the novel, and another in its own kind of moral imperatives. Sorry, Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, Justin, you wanted to come
in? No, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to echo that. That I think this novel seems much more deliberate and polished in those particular ways than Conversations with Friends. And when I was talking about those differences, I think I may have implied that I thought Normal People was the better novel. I don't, in fact. I think Conversations with Friends, because it has a kind of a rawness and less of a polish than Normal People. It was certainly a novel that I enjoyed better. But yeah, I agree completely with Adrian, what he said there, that there is very conscious deliberation of setting this novel within a novelistic tradition. And also at the same time, I think a very deliberate attempt to make this a successful novel.
Just to say, as a kind of educationist, to put this on a course as Patrick and I have done, is kind of interesting in itself, because you do watch people being educated in Normal People. I mean, in the TV series, it's very abbreviated because you can't do the same detail. But there is a moment in which you have Connell as going to an English class in which he says, "I agree with everyone else." Like, that's a version of the hagiography of Yeats or something. "I just agree, he's great. We don't have to talk about it." And then you do see him struggling, but coming to terms to articulate something that's different. And I think the thing they're discussing is Jane Austen, of course, and the structure of Jane Austen's narrative. So it's clear that I think Rooney, you know, self-consciously is interested in the structure of narratives from a very, you know, from a 19th century perspective. I don't mean to say that means it's old-fashioned, but yeah, I think it's something as an educationist that, you know, of course, it's an old school idea, but what reading a novel should do, it should help us make us think more interesting things, or empathize with people, or become better people somehow by reading these other people's lives, or perhaps also having opinions about them. And so that, as an educator, it's kind of interesting to be part of that self-conscious phenomenon.
That's interesting. Funny enough, I was kind of reminded unexpectedly of Jane Austen when I was rereading the book, partly of the oblique communication between Connell and Marianne. This, in spite of their great intimacy, there's lots of things that they can't say to one another, and where they're regularly interpreting one another in that private kind of interior way that Patrick was also talking about. I wanted to just note a question we've had here from Gabriela in Brazil. And she says, here, Sally Rooney is also a phenomenon. And she asks, I wonder if you can comment on the use of third-person narration, because it seems there is not an only narrator. Who is telling us the history? So, I mean, that's an interesting point about narration in the book. I don't know whether perhaps Patrick or Justin might have a thought on that. Patrick, do you want to?
I mean, I can talk a bit about how the students maybe responded to it. So, I mean, I think they saw that it's not really a third person narrative. It's getting into the minds of the individual characters, in the way that, you know, we get into the mind of Stephen Dedalus in A Portrait, or we get into the mind of you know, of Lois in The Last September. And so I think, you know, the illusion of the omniscient narrator actually arises in the fact that the two stories often don't add up. One of the things I wrote about particularly effectively was a scene in which Connell and Marianne are sitting side by side in a swimming pool, and he is publicly affectionate to her. And in her mind, this is, you know, a moment of wonderful intimacy between the two of them, but in his mind, he's in a state of utter agony. And I think, you know, from experience, we can all understand that idea that two people can be in the same situation and interpret it completely differently and both be right. But I think what she's done in this novel is to use the interior monologue of the characters as a way to bring that to the fore. And this really allows us to understand the idea that there is no such thing as normal people, that everybody sees things from their own point of view, that none of us are normal.
That certainly is part of, you know, it definitely is a refrain in the book itself, naturally, and I picked up in the title. There's so many interesting, all sorts of questions I want to ask people about and get their views on, and these are such a random mixture, I have to apologize. One of the things that sort of gets me about it is the smoking in the book and the smoking in the series. Like, what's the deal with the smoking? I apologize for offering this to no one and to everyone at the same time, but was anyone else struck by the smoking? And you know,
just to say one thing, I was struck in terms of moral terms, in terms of, you know, showing an example to the world. I haven't seen so much smoking in a TV series for a long time. That was, I mean, I think I see the point of it. I think it was a little overdone, but it was partly to try and explore the silence. I think the drama, the TV drama, in its most interesting parts is exploring kind of silence, the kind of gaps, the things that people don't say, as I think Justin mentioned. And to do that, it's quite daring. It doesn't always use background music. It sometimes has quite a long period of silences or someone breathing or those kind of things to make the noise. And I think that's partly where it comes from. The problem is when you have people standing around not doing anything in a TV series, that, you know, it's difficult. So that they need to kind of mark, these people are being thoughtful and they're somehow outsiders. And the easy way of doing that is to have them smoke, I think. And I think that's partly why they do it. But it's partly the problem that changing a book with all the subtleties that Patrick was talking about in the narration, how it does it into a screen thing in which you kind of literally can't get inside people's heads unless you do something like a voiceover interior monologue, which is clearly not the kind of thing that they were hoping to do in terms of understanding the characters and getting close to them.
That's very interesting. I mean, I wanted to say, because this is, you know, we're also thinking about the West here, and you know, I think, Justin, you were talking about relationships between, you know, the urban and the rural and so forth. But the positioning of the book in relation to the West and the metropolitan context associated with Trinity is quite interesting. Keith, I don't know if you have a kind of comment on that. I mean, there is the foregrounding, certainly in the series of you know, the Gaelic Games element. It's although, and you pointed out that actually in the novel it's soccer that he's playing. Curiously enough, he just says soccer first and then later football. So, I mean, what's your kind of reading on the West and how that figures in it? I'd be interested in your take on that.
In the TV show or the book or both?
Well, yeah, either really. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really well. If I was speaking to someone who hadn't watched, he's just allergic to hype and therefore hadn't watched the TV show when it was on, and just started watching on the player there. And he was saying to me, like, I grew up in Donegal, not that far away from where that school world is set, and there is very much that sense of here and there when you're at that age. You know, once you leave town, once you leave school, that, you know, you're going to a very, very definite elsewhere. I think in the book as well, quite early on, I think it's Marianne who encourages Connell to go to Trinity, and he's saying, you know, if he'd gone to Galway, you know, things would be the same. He'd be with the people he knew. They'd all be there. They'd just get the bus up home the weekend. He'd probably play a bit of GA, but he'd be going to a different world if he went to Trinity. I went to Galway, so I don't know what that Trinity world would have been like, but yeah, there is. I think it's very much, you know, it's very much here and there in both the TV show, and the book.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think Justin has the advantage of us and having been an undergraduate at Trinity. So I'm sort of curious about what you thought of it as a representation of Trinity.
Some of it felt very close and familiar to my experience. If I leave it at that, people will go, ooh. But no, I also grew up in the countryside and moved to the city. And so parts of that I thought rang very true. Of course, there are elements of this in conversations with friends as well, which is set among Trinity students too. I mean, I'm kind of interested and amused at how Trinity have capitalized on their representation in the novel for marketing purposes. I did think, just in terms of smoking as well, that when I knew that the series was going to be filmed, I thought about the famous ramp of the arts block in Trinity, which you had to fight your way through in order to get into the building, because it was where people went to smoke, and it was among the least glamorous places on campus. So I wondered if they would capture that kind of side of Trinity life. Perhaps not. There are a lot, well, in the episodes that I've seen so far, there are a lot more kind of parties on campus outside the rubrics and things like this. And I thought, wow, those would have been cleared away in a second by the security guard. It's some very interesting elements to the depictions. Yeah,
that's interesting. There's a question that's come in that I think I might direct towards Charlotte. And this is somebody who wants to, Hannah Grayson, who wants to build on Charlotte's comments on the complexity of trauma, and also what Adrian said about watching the characters be readers. Could panelists comment, and again, I might ask Charlotte if she would pick this up, on the presence of internet and screens in the text or series, particularly perhaps about the recording of experience, e.g. photos of Marianne in Sweden, and how that is very different from circa 19th century novels, very much more of the current time. I don't know, Charlotte, if that's something that resonates with you about the nature screen, or possibly even that the episode of photography itself, and how that somewhat troubling incident at her time in Sweden.
Yeah, I suppose there's three brief things that I would say about it. One of the most moving and I think indicative moments in the series for me of the kind of arc that I was describing, but that also managed to catch something beyond that, is the moment where Connell wants her to send him a nude, a selfie of herself naked, and she is so upset because of the experience of abuse that she has experienced from her brother that she can't do it, and that delicacy or that moment of vulnerability in how we choose to share our bodies in those ways, I thought was really beautifully captured. But again, with like juxtaposed with the trauma that she's experiencing in the home, that her sexuality is always going to be messed up there. with the photography episode in Sweden, I mean, I suppose, again, coming back, you know, what is going on there about BDSM, about what is being pictured, again, is, I think, a misunderstanding of those practices. But also the thing, I suppose, that I find really interesting and troubling in the novel is that even as Marianne does not really want this, it is her trauma, we are getting to watch her experience these things in the eye of the viewer. So even though the selfie never gets sent to Connell, even though, you know, she walks away and it's this moment of empowerment in the photo session that she doesn't want and she steps away, we still get to look. And we get to look at Paul Mescal a lot in this series, right? And so we can also have an interesting conversation about how male sex object has been reconfigured through him. But it's falling back on, you know, tropes of photography and bodies and looking at female bodies and violated bodies that go back a really long time. There's nothing new there. There's a lot that's archetypal that is getting recirculated. And I think with that photography episode in Sweden as well, there's a pivot that happens in the series that I felt even more strongly in the series than in the book, because right after that, Connell begins to get depressed. We haven't touched on, I think, the beautiful handling of his depression, anxiety, therapy. So moving. You know, I feel like Connell really is the center of the series. I feel like I know Connell, that I teach him every day, know him. However, from that point in the series, Marianne across the screen, like when she stays up all night with him while he's upset, becomes very much, in my opinion, constructed by his gaze and for him. He gets to become an artist. She's a history and philosophy major. We don't know what the hell she's interested in. She says she's apolitical. And that, you know, what do we do with that? So screens operate to both index their relationships and also give us a lot of information about how young people are experiencing sexuality today in new ways, as well as ways that are archetypal going to the 19th century and earlier.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think Marianne is meant to be studying politics and history. I kind of found that unconvincing, to be honest. She doesn't really have a whole lot to say on this.
Not a scholarship, so we know she's smart, which is great. Yeah, gets disinherited. But like, come on, like I want more. Like, I'm tired of hearing about how this novel, you know, it's intellectual, but like, what books are the women reading? At the end, she goes off and like watches movies with her friend, and that's her liberation. Like, we can do better.
Yeah, Maria, I think you wanted to come in on that. I was curious to get your view.
Well, it's kind of, there's so much in my head, and you know, what I keep asking myself is why we've been so obsessed with this book and particularly the series. But I think it builds on what Charlotte is saying. There's one word that really is big for me, and it's shame. I think this whole series, this whole book is struggling with shame. And in my opinion, we know better Connell's shame. We care about Marianne because Connell cares about Marianne, because he's better constructed. We see, you know, that's what I had a problem with. And I fell for it too. I only cared about her because I cared about him. But the shame that this novel and that program is so heavy with, I think and the vulnerability, that's what gets us, you know, when you have, and the fragility and the force and that play all the time. And I think in the novel, she just talks about the space between them, and we forget about all the other spaces. And in the television series, that is made visually for us beautifully by both directors, both focusing on vastness and tiny intricacies. And in that, we can see the cracks and the shame and the vulnerability, and how we all know how complex that is. And I think that's where we're just sucked in.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually had a question that's come in that I want to direct towards Diane, I think, and it's really about, I'm recasting the question a little bit, about, I guess this is a kind of maybe a landmark moment, obviously in terms of the representation of sexuality. The question is also interested in the different reactions according to different age groups in Ireland. Do you think it is a transformative moment? Is this one that people are going to remember, either, you know, the series, I mean, presumably the series in a particular kind of way rather than the book in a particular kind of way, marks out a certain moment in time?
I do, actually. I think that for two reasons, essentially. One is I think that Normal People is emerging as maybe the preeminent example that we've got of post-referenda Irish TV. We haven't touched on this, but yeah. This is you know, a major success in the period after 2015's vote for equal marriage, the 2008 vote for abortion rights. And I think part of the fascination that people have with the series is that it helps to pose the question of, you know, what does a society that has so conspicuously endorsed sweeping change in regard to sexuality and personal choice feel like. So I think that's one of the things that it's doing. Then I think to circle back really quite a long way to the question of pandemic television, I think myself and other critics have been arguing of late that television has had a renewal in the last couple of months, and that part of its renewal it can be attributed to how TV has this capacity to symbolically undo social distancing. And so I think the narrative of normal people and its capacity to stage these very charged questions about intimacy and couplehood also fits into this moment, because pandemic culture also has had this resurgence in romance and couplehood, right? So on the one hand, we've had like a deep vein of media coverage that talks about the creativity and the resourcefulness of couples who've found ways to get married, and HBO has this new series called Love Life, you know, and there have been kind of emphases on couples finding ways to have date nights, things like this, whereas the single household is almost inevitably cast as like a site of despair and disconnection. So I think that the fact that this series, among all the other things that it does, puts the couple front and center, makes it a very apposite text for this particular moment. And then I think, you know, going back to things that Tony had touched on earlier, I think we have to kind of carefully parse its relationship to institutions like RTE, but at the same time, you know, and looking at it perhaps, especially from an international vantage point, its ability to circulate something that to many people, I'm not taking a position on whether this is right or wrong, you know, looks, feels credibly Irish is certainly part of how it's being understood in the marketplace and in the culture.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Mehar, I wanted to ask you a question. I'm sort of interested in, because you're new to Ireland, I think, in that sense of your sense of it as an Irish book. And there's an aspect, this may not be something of interest to you, but I was just kind of curious about it as the fatherless narrative is kind of interesting. The absent fathers. I mean, fathers have such an outsized role in Irish fiction and drama that it's sort of interesting, a book that is sort of refusing that. So I don't know if either of those two things are things you wanted to comment on.
No, I think it's pretty incredible that we do see, what we see is an aftermath of the violence that was perpetuated years before possibly Marianne was born, but that still leaves a gaping hole in the family. And it's important to see how these people react to the absence of a father. Like, would there be more violence if the father was still alive? Would there be less? I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, no, it was interesting to see. And I absolutely loved all the Irish references in the book. Like like having lived here for 9 months now, I can definitely say that it did feel authentic to me, even from my own limited experience. And I really enjoyed watching all these beautiful landscapes, even in the TV series. Like, I live on the Long Walk in Galway, and the TV series still managed to take my breath away. Like, I think they did a good job with that. So yeah, from an Indian's perspective, I think I did well.
Charlotte, I think you had your hand up there. Yeah.
Just briefly on the look or feel of Ireland and Ireland Now in the series, I also want to, I guess, shout out or draw attention to, I think, the really careful decision to have racially and ethnically diverse actors featured in the series as actors and as extras and in supporting roles. A role was actually created for Kwaku Fortune, who is an up-and-coming African-Irish actor who was also in Louise O'Neill's stage production of Asking for It, as was Paul Mescal. And, you know, I mean, we could use that as a jumping off point to think about whiteness or implicit whiteness in Rooney's novels, which I think, you know, I love to get into at some point. I will say that I was a bit troubled by the casting of the most aggressive male character in the novel, Lucas, as a Swedish man of color, given the kinds of stereotypes attached to immigrant men of color in Europe quite frequently. But then again, you know, we could think of him as balanced by the kind of Aryanism of Jamie in the particular casting choice. But I think that also becomes interesting, thinking about Helen as the foil to Lucas at that moment, and that she as well is a minority ethnic Irish actor. So I think there's, you know, what's going on there subconsciously, I don't know, but in general, I just hope that more series, you know, make the same commitment to showing Ireland as it is now.
Yeah, that is an extremely interesting side of it. I think that's very interesting. And the Helen character, who there's no reference to her ethnicity in the book.
I want to see her series. That's when I got to her, I was like, I want to see her series, you know, like she, you know, that actress.
And the actor sort of brought a lot to it, just with facial expression, because it's an unrealized character in many ways. But that was, I thought, extremely interesting. And you're right, because the Lucas, isn't he called Lucas? I think the Swedish guy I think his hair that is so blonde it's white. You know, it's like, okay, you know, they went in another direction there in terms of the casting. Tony, I should apologize for because of your film expertise of asking you about intimacy coordinators. This seems to be a new profession that has taken off and in its own right received a lot of attention. So by all means, refuse that topic, but I'm just interested in the handling of intimacy more generally in the film and the obligations of the filmmaker now in the present moment.
Well, I may not be the person to ask about this, as I generally, and I'm not, obviously I feel outside of the target demographic for much of the film's issues around sexuality, I suppose. I would say that there's, all of the intimacy scenes were shot on the same day, and almost all of them anyway. And I did enjoy the kind of sense of progression and a narrative of intimacy there and intimate relations. The other thing I would say about, and this role of intimacy coordinator, obviously, and I think this is well known, and is a new role, and it's a new kind of a role on set. And I know that Lenny had voiced some reservation, you know, as the primary director, of allowing another director to come into the space, and has said, actually, I was quite pleased and surprised by what that facilitated, and that allowed conversation to exist between the cast and the directors of those scenes. I think the other thing I would say is that there's been a great deal of talk about the relationship between this the TV show and the novel and the previous novel. One avenue of investigation that I would obviously be interested in thinking about would be about the Irish cinema dimension and where this relates to Irish film more generally, and perhaps beginning with what Diane referred to earlier on as auteured kind of a text. And the other auteur here obviously is Lenny Abrahamson, and trying to think about how this might relate to his body of work, which has kind of it's been quite diverse, but has overwhelmingly dealt with masculinity and questions of male identity, albeit in quite a number of different contexts, with the homeless in Adam and Paul, and Middle Ireland in Garage, and then last year with Little Stranger, which didn't do very much business, but then obviously in Frank as well. And Room obviously is the sort of outlier on that. Yeah. So, and what Richard did, which is probably closest to it in many respects in terms of its social class basis and issues of rural and urban divide there, which is an interesting kind of inside-outside commonality that it shares with this. And Lenny's kind of insider-outsider status himself, having attended Trinity, where he met producer Ed Guiney, where they began the films, the university's film society, and where the seeds for this was sown some 30 years ago. And so this is a kind of return to their own biographical roots in a certain sense. But Lenny's status as a Jewish-Irish man, and that kind of ongoing interest that he has in male figures who are both insiders, outsiders, and men who are not traditional Irish males in many respects, whether that's intellectual or otherwise. And so I think that's a really interesting set of conversations. And if, as Charlotte, I think, or others have suggested, that this series maybe is more concerned with Connell, that maybe that's one of the reasons why, and one of the avenues that we could pursue. But I would also say, finally, in relation to the question about the intimacy coordinator, it probably should be seen within the wider kind of very self-conscious behavior exhibited by the producer Ed Guiney and the director Lenny Abrahamson towards inclusiveness and inclusivity and questions of respect. And following Me Too in particular within the film industry. So that when you look at the credits of the film, there's a really strong attempt to, if you like, water down or kind of counterpoint or counteract a dominant male gaze, whether that is in the fact that the two cinematographers, to come back to the issues of screen representation, the two cinematographers in the film are both women. That there is a 50-50 participation in screenwriting and obviously also in the directorial. So there's a very interesting and deliberate decision taken by the producers and the production company to try to balance the gaze and the kind of articulation of points of view. To just conclude by saying that issue about smoking and the difficulty for the TV show of moving from an internal dialogue and in monologues to representative externalization of action and thought, I'm not sure really works a lot of the time. And I have to say that I really felt there was some rather clunky exposition about how smart Connell was. I never really felt him to be that smart. And for a guy who got a scholarship for writing, I never saw him do very much writing either. So there was, I think something fell away there in the transfer to screen.
That's very interesting. I mean, we've well exceeded our time, and we'll come to a close in a moment. But you've that's opened the way to a thought that I had, where I thought it would have read and played differently if Marianne had been the writer who goes off on a writing scholarship to New York. I think that would be so identified with Sally Rooney herself. I think it almost had to be Connell taking that direction. But that in itself raises interesting questions in itself about whether Sally Rooney is identifying, in a sense, more with Connell to that extent. So that was just a thought that had occurred to me in looking at it again. Thank you very much to all of you. Patrick, you've got your hand up. Let's come back to Patrick.
Yeah, just very, very quickly. I mean, I wanted to pick up on the point about Tony earlier said that, RTE, were producers of this, but that it had been put together by others. I think we should just pause briefly and say that this, the TV series would not have been possible without Irish theatre companies like Rough Magic and Druid, who developed actors like Paul Mescal, who developed actors like Sarah Green. And just to say that at a time, when arts funding is yet again going to be cut, if we didn't have an independent theatre sector in this country, the TV phenomenon of Normal People could not have happened in the way that it did. So I think we need to see that investing in the independent arts sector pays off very handsomely in things like the success of Normal People.
I think we can all applaud that, absolutely. And I think a very good note to end on. Thank you all so much for a really wonderfully rich, interesting, fascinating discussion. So many different avenues for thinking about both the book and the series. And thanks everybody to attending today. And we, as I say, we've well exceeded our time, but that's a measure of how interesting the conversation was. So thank you again.